The sound wasn't water. It wasn't an explosion, not exactly. It was the low, sick rumble of 2,300,000 gallons of fermented sweetness ripping itself free. January 15th, 1919, Boston's North End. They thought sugar was safe. They were wrong. This disaster, this 8-story tidal wave moving at 35 miles per hour, this was not a flood of water. This was the city choked by its own relentless, viscous greed. We are told the Great Molasses Flood was an industrial accident, a historical quirk, a bizarre footnote about a tank that burst. That is the comforting lie history sells to keep us docile. The truth is simple and far more brutal. This was a perfectly engineered structural murder. It was the inevitable payoff of corner cutting and corporate deafness, paid for in 21 suffocated lives and 150 injured. Do not sanitize this. Do not call it merely strange. Call it what it was, a lesson delivered by the cruelest, stickiest teacher imaginable. The stoic reality is that pain is the only legitimate auditor. You cannot argue physics with 26,000 tons of density, and you certainly cannot negotiate with a failed seam of steel. Purity Distilling Company. They were the architects of this slow-motion calamity. They needed that massive tank built immediately to capitalize on the wartime sugar rush and the coming prohibition booze bonanza. Speed over safety, always. The steel was too thin. The tank was never properly tested. Even before the catastrophe, residents complained. They saw thick, brown leaks oozing from the rivets, dripping down the sides of the 50-foot structure. The weeping was so immediate, so persistent, that the company didn't even bother to paint the tank. The constant flow made it pointless. Management dismissed every warning with a shrug and a smile, saying, "It's just molasses, harmless." That level of casual arrogance is the real crime. They banked on luck. Luck always sends a bill. Now, look at the mechanism of failure. Molasses is heavy, far heavier than water. It expands and contracts dramatically with temperature. The bitter cold of that January day stressed the already compromised steel walls past their breaking point. That thermal stress, combined with the immense hydrostatic pressure from 250,000 cubic feet of syrupy weight, created the perfect internal bomb. The resulting sound, a sharp crack, like a massive shotgun blast, was followed instantly by chaos. The sheer kinetic force of the discharge, not a spill but a detonation, was so immense it ripped streetcar tracks from the pavement, twisted heavy steel girders into ribbons, and lifted a fire station entirely off its foundation, sweeping it into the harbor. This wasn't liquid dynamics. It was liquid concrete setting instantly the moment it slowed down. If you instinctively reject the comforting lie and prefer the sharp, sticky edge of historical truth over the neat, clean narrative, you understand exactly why we need to dig into these mechanisms. You should stay right here. The poor souls caught in the initial wave didn't just drown. That would have been merciful. They were crushed, immobilized, suffocated by sheer density. Molasses is non-Newtonian when packed tight. It binds. Imagine being pinned under a substance that smells like Christmas but weighs like wet cement, gradually hardening as the cold permeates it. Rescuers found victims entombed upright, locked in the brown viscosity, rendered into sugary statues. The recovery effort was a nightmare that lasted for weeks. Firefighters had to hose down the entire neighborhood with salt water pumped straight from the bay, transforming the streets into a chest-high, sticky graveyard. And the stink? The stench of fermentation, of dead sugar, lingered in Boston's North End for decades. a constant reminder of the structural debt that was finally paid in blood and syrup. This was not fate. This was poor engineering. Forget the physics lesson for a moment. Who truly pulled the trigger on that catastrophe? Purity Distilling Company. They are the true villains here. They built the tank fast. Cheap rivets, thin walls. They engineered a structural disaster based on sheer, reckless impatience. They knew it leaked for months. Residents complained constantly about the groaning sounds, the dark syrup slicking the streets. A sinister, sticky warning sign the neighborhood learned to fear. Did the company reinforce it? Did they empty it? Don't be naive. They simply painted the rusted tank brown to hide the structural evidence, hoping to sneak in another 1,000,000 gallons of sweet profit before the inevitable occurred. A cheap coat of paint over a looming catastrophe. That is the cold, brutal reality of industrial arrogance. This wasn't just poor engineering. It was criminal malfeasance executed by men in expensive suits. They calculated the risk, minimized the cost, and maximized the danger to everyone living downwind. The moment you understand that history is always a transaction, a cost paid by the weak for the comfort of the strong, everything snaps into terrifying focus. If you instinctively value exposing these hidden sins, if you believe that history should serve as a sharp, sticky warning rather than a comforting bedtime story, then maybe you belong right here. Now, the aftermath was a disgrace disguised as an investigation. Purity Distilling fought tooth and nail. They tried to blame anarchists. Seriously, they spent the first weeks peddling the convenient lie that the tank was blown up by Italian radicals. A desperate attempt to turn a simple structural debt into a shadowy political threat. But the evidence fought back. The truth, in this case, was forensic. A groundbreaking legal case followed, essentially a class action lawsuit filed by the victims' families against this monstrous corporation. The company's defense was masterful corporate gaslighting. They claimed it was an act of God, unforeseeable, an unusual temperature fluctuation. You there? Don't buy the clean story? Judge Hugh Ogden, tasked with sorting through 3,000 different exhibits and months of conflicting testimony, had to become a structural engineer overnight. Experts testified about stress fractures. They talked about fatigue failure. Ogden realized the core issue was never about temperature or terrors. It was about foreseeability. Could an ordinary man, using ordinary prudence, have predicted the failure of this poorly designed tank? The evidence was overwhelming. The engineer who ultimately held Purity Distilling fully responsible, forcing them to pay out what was then an unprecedented amount to the victims. But let's be clear, money never buys back crushed bone or cleanses the memory of suffocation by sugar. The actual victory wasn't the payout. The victory was establishing a precedent. The disaster forced American industry to confront the idea that their negligence was measurable, that cutting corners had a quantifiable human price, and that the internal dynamics of a tank, the thickness of the steel, the quality of the rivets, was legally defensible evidence against corporate greed. Before the Molasses flood, American courts gave massive corporations the benefit of the doubt. After this disaster, that assumption dissolved, replaced by a cold, hard demand for accountability. No more acts of God, just bad math and worse morality. Molasses became the unlikely catalyst for modern corporate regulation, forcing safety and engineering standards onto industries that previously prioritized only speed and volume. It cost 21 human lives and 150 injuries. But finally, the invisible cost of profit became visible. We stopped asking, did something break? And started demanding, who allowed it to break? And that shift, that small pivot in legal language, changed everything. Profit hates friction. Safety is pure friction. So profit hates safety. Simple math. We keep pretending it's complicated, a gray area, a necessary balancing act between innovation and prudence, but it's black and white. This wasn't a one-off mistake in 1919 Boston. It was the inevitable product of a system built on speed, volume, and willful blindness. Purity Distilling, like every mega corporation before and since, wasn't trying to kill people. They were simply internalizing the risk. They calculated the cost of proper, thick steel, proper rivets, and proper engineering oversight, and found that cost too high. They weighed that expense against the actuarial probability of a catastrophic failure, and decided the odds were in their favor. They bet 21 human lives against a few $1,000s in better construction. They lost the bet, but only because the legal system finally forced them to pay the ante. Most of the time, they win. You need to understand this mechanism. Corporate culture does not eliminate risk. It merely calculates the acceptable loss. It files the potential failure under unforeseen liabilities. Unforeseen? Baloney? They knew the tank hummed. They knew the rivets spat. They saw the workers painting the tank brown to hide the constant sticky leaks seeping through the cheap steel seams. Arthur Gell was an architect, not an engineer, managing a project far beyond his competence, and the men above him allowed it. They encouraged that ignorance. Ignorance is cheap. Accountability is expensive. The core mechanism of disaster is rarely a lack of information. It's the institutional refusal to process the terrifying information already available. Think about it. Everyone smelled the trouble. They ignored the scent. That denial, that is the corporate blueprint for catastrophe. And you believe things are fundamentally better now, right? We have OSHA. We have advanced safety regulators. We have standards written in blood, signed and stamped in triplicate. Cute. The only thing that truly changed after the Molasses flood was that corporations learned to document the cutting of corners better. They learned to hire liability lawyers who could dance around negligence using semantics and structured legal shields. The industries that need the most stringent oversight are often the ones staffing the very regulatory bodies designed to police them. It's a revolving door, a cynical, highly profitable dance. They simply substituted amateur gels with highly credentialed gels. Men and women who understand compliance checklists, but still prioritize margin over metal thickness. The underlying moral calculus remains untouched. We still build infrastructure with cost-optimized materials that have limited lifespans. We call it efficiency. We schedule maintenance based on budget cycles, not structural integrity. We call it smart management. The Molasses flood established that the failure of a structure is legally traceable to the hands that built it, yes. But that only means the next generation of predators got better at sanitizing the paper trail. They learned the jargon. They didn't hire more true engineers, they hired more risk managers. The dark, sticky lesson of Boston, Massachusetts, is that your life, your safety, the integrity of your community is consistently calculated as an input cost. That is all you are. A variable in their grand ledger. Stop believing the myth of the benevolent modern corporation. They are structural predators, and the disaster wasn't an accident. It was a failure of imagination combined with a perfect cheap storm of institutional arrogance. That deadly combination still governs our construction sites, still dictates the speed of our supply chains, still sets the terms for how often bridges get inspected. The molasses never stopped flowing. It just turned invisible, disguised as quarterly returns. The price of convenience is the acceptance of acceptable risk, and we, the public, are always the ones paying the premium. The disaster wasn't the tank bursting. That was merely the symptom. The true structural disaster is what we chose to ignore immediately afterward, and what we continue to ignore today. We crave comfort. We demand speed. We want our goods cheap and our lives uninterrupted. And we believe implicitly in the institutional promise of safety, despite all available evidence. This credulity is the single greatest enabler of corporate homicide. When the Molasses flood settled, the city did not demand a fundamental re-engineering of risk assessment. They only demanded better paperwork. They demanded a scapegoat that could be efficiently processed through the courts, allowing the larger, more powerful mechanism of industrial optimization to continue unimpeded. The system learned how to make negligence look like an unavoidable tragedy. That is the only innovation that came out of 1919. Now, we are all living inside that paper-thin, cost-optimized structure. Look around you. You see efficiency. I see a timeline to failure. They know exactly when the structural integrity of the aging pipeline, the overburdened bridge, or the cheap container ship crosses the acceptable threshold of risk. That point, they call it the projected failure rate, is written in cold black ink in some risk manager's spreadsheet. Your personal safety is already accounted for in the quarterly projections, a tiny acceptable fraction of liability. Your outrage is irrelevant. It is an externalized cost, absorbed entirely by the victim and their family, never by the balance sheet. This cynicism is the operating philosophy of modern construction. We fetishize the spectacle of collapse, the viral videos of train derailments, the tragic headlines of dam bursts, but we refuse to confront the boring, invisible process of moral decay that precedes the bang. That's the hardest lesson Molasses gave us. It demands relentless, exhausting patience. It requires the constant, aggressive inspection of the mundane. Stop waiting for the next spectacular eruption of sticky destruction. It's already here. It's just moving slower, disguised as scheduled maintenance delays and budget cuts. The Boston Molasses flood wasn't an anomaly that proved the danger of poorly built tanks. It was a forecast. A dark prophecy fulfilled every time a corner is cut and an accident is deemed unforeseen by the same people who designed the failure into the blueprint. The core system does not incentivize safety. It incentivizes plausible deniability. It incentivizes the smooth, uninterrupted flow of capital, which is the only liquid that truly matters to them. Stop calling these events accidents. They are choices. They are calculated risks executed by someone else for their specific, immediate profit. The only way out of this cynical equation is to accept the pain of vigilance and the cost of true integrity. If you refuse to look at the ledger, if you refuse to demand the impossible fundamental structural changes, then you have silently agreed to become the next column of input data. The truth flows thicker than molasses, and it demands that you feel the impossible weight of that realization. The question is no longer how to prevent the next collapse, but how you intend to live in the infrastructure of calculated failure. You see the crack in the foundation. You taste the rot in the bureaucracy, and you decide. Are you going to be the engineer who documents the fault line and demands a shutdown, knowing it will cost you your career? Or are you the manager who stamps the substandard report, rationalizing that the probability of failure is still low enough for this quarter's bonus? This is not philosophy. This is architecture. It is built entirely on the spine of your daily moral compromises. The verdict is definitive and cruel. You are not victimized by these systems. You participate in them by demanding everything be faster, cheaper, and instantly available, allowing them no margin for true quality. We love the narrative of the tragic hero fighting the giant corporation, but we hate the inconvenience of the actual fight, the cost, the bureaucratic sludge, the slowness of justice. The truth is heavy. The truth is slow. It is the antithesis of the modern transaction. It takes the molasses flood, a literal physical sticky catastrophe, to teach us that the most dangerous thing is not the speed of the accident, but the depth of our willingness to ignore the obvious until the pressure finally becomes terminal. Stop searching for the hidden conspiracy. The mechanism is transparently simple. Risk is distributed downward. Profit is siphoned upward. That's the rule. It has always been the rule. The tank will fail. The bridge will groan. The dam will breach. It is simply a matter of time and maximizing the shareholder value in the interim. Your pain, your loss, your entire future, it is all just the externalized variable they budgeted for years ago. The molasses flood proved that gravity is patient. Finance is patient. It never forgets. It simply waits. So ask yourself, not what systems failed, but what vigilance you failed to execute today. The world does not need your pity. It requires your uncompromising spine. The true cost of integrity is perpetual exhaustion. Pay it. We look for comfort. We demand a safety net. The comforting lie that complex industrial structures, be they financial algorithms, concrete megaprojects, or high-speed data pipelines, can be inherently protected against human error and greed, is the most lethal form of modern superstition we embrace. You are praying to the spreadsheet. Stop it. The truth is, you live in a world of persistent rot, a perpetual state of engineering failure stabilized only by the frantic, underpaid labor of the few people left who still care enough to tighten the bolts everyone else ignored. That dedication, that commitment to the integrity of the invisible joint, that's what you rely on, and you pay that critical mind nothing while rewarding the idiot who managed to cut the cost by 17%. We celebrate the savings, then we mourn the inevitable tragedy. It is perverse. It is predictable. But here is the final unvarnished piece of glass you must swallow. The systems fail precisely because they are designed to transfer the cost of maintenance and true vigilance onto the individual while channeling the benefits to the abstract shareholder. This is the great architecture of modern spite. It's an economic equation. Never call it a failure of judgment. It is always strictly a calculated success of externalization. Think about that next time you seek reassurance. Reassurance is the first stage of intellectual decay. The molasses flood didn't just explode out of the tank. It exploded out of the ledger book. It was a tax we paid for allowing cheapness to stand in for competence. That syrupy tide never dries. The sticky residue of that compromised history clings to everything we build today. It's in the cheap steel, the rushed code, the exhausted face of the inspector who just signed off on the fourth incomplete job this week because he needs the paycheck. and knows no one will actually check his checker. This is how the failure propagates. This is the true pandemic. The contagion of apathy masquerading as efficiency. The verdict stands. There is no external villain. The villain is the collective inertia, the willful ignorance, the deep compass we find in pretending someone else is watching the gauges. Nobody is. You must be the one who watches. You must assume that every structure holding up your world, physical, economic, or legal, is currently under maximum load and minimum viable maintenance. You must operate on the assumption that collapse is not a possibility, but a certainty that can only be delayed by your own relentless, painful engagement. Forget the narrative of fighting the man. The man is already gone. He is abstract. He is distributed. You are fighting the gravitational pull of convenience, the seductive promise of an easy life. That promise is a lie designed to make you complacent just long enough for the floor to drop out. Pain is the only teacher. Listen to the groan of the structure, not the smooth assurances of the bureaucrat. Your life, your integrity, your civilization, it is held together only by the constant agonizing friction of those who refuse to accept mediocrity as fate. Pay the cost of integrity. Pay it daily. Demand the spine in yourself that you demand in the structures around you. Stop looking for safety. Start looking for responsibility. That is the only real foundation.